Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to start part 2 of Little Blue Book number 49, titled 3 Lectures on Evolution, written by Ernst Haeckel. And Ernst Haeckel wrote these 3 lectures in 1905, 1906. There's no copyright date, but in the foreword, a letter was written in 1905. And I think these lectures were given right around that time in Berlin. So, let's see, here we go. And make sure, let's see. Okay. Should slowly. Appreciate because it is made so thoroughly and consistent to use ideas of evolution. Okay, here we go. Let me go back just a page and pick up the paragraph. Let me see. Okay, let's see here. Here we go. But this general resignation of reason and the dominance of supernatural ideas which it encouraged were somewhat paradoxical in the 30 years between Lyell and Darwin, between 1830 and 1859, since the natural evolution of the earth, as conceived by the great geologist, had come to be universally recognized. Since the earlier of these dates, the iron necessity of natural law had rolled in inorganic nature, in the formation of the mountains and the movement of the heavenly bodies. In organic nature, on the contrary, in the creation and the life of animals and plants, people saw only the wisdom and the power of an intelligent creator and controller. In other words, everything was ruled by mechanical causality in the inorganic world, but by teleological finality in the realm of biology. Philosophy, strictly so called, paid little or no attention to this dilemma. Absorbed almost exclusively in metaphysical and dialectical speculations, it looked with supreme contempt or indifference on the enormous progress that the empirical science were making. It affected, in its character of purely mental science, to build up the world out of its own head, and to have no need of the splendid material that was being laboriously gathered by observation and experiment. This is especially true of Germany, where Hegel's system of absolute idealism had secured the highest regard, particularly since it had been made obligatory as the royal state philosophy of Prussia, mainly because, according to Hegel, in the state, the divine will itself and the monarchical constitution alone represents the development of reason. All other forms of constitution are lower stages of the development, also been greatly appreciated because it has made so thorough and consistent a use of the idea of evolution. But this pretended evolution of reason floated far above real nature in the pure ether of the absolute spirit, and was devoid of all the material ballast that the empirical science of the evolution of the world, the earth, and its living population had meantime accumulated. Moreover, it is well known how Hegel himself declared with humorous resignation that only one of his many pupils had understood him, and this one had misunderstood him. From the higher standpoint of general culture, the different question forces itself on us. Oh, that's a difficult question, forces itself on us. What is the real value of the idea of evolution in the whole realm of science? We are bound to answer that it varies considerably. The facts of the evolution of the individual, or of ontology, were easy to observe and grasp. The evolution of the crust of the earth and of the mountains in geology seem to have an equally sound empirical foundation. The physical evolution of the universe seems to be established by mathematical speculation. There is no longer any serious question of creation in the literal sense, of the deliberate action of a personal creator. In these great providences, but this made people cling to the idea more than ever in regard to the origin of the countless species of animals and plants, and especially the creation of man. This transcendental problem seemed to be entirely beyond the range of natural development, and the same was thought of the question of the nature and origin of the soul, the mystic entity that was appropriated by metaphysical speculation as its subject. Charles Darwin suddenly brought a clear light into the dark chaos of contradictory notions in 1859. His epoch-making work, The Origin of Species, proved convincingly that his historical process is not a supernatural mystery, but a physiological phenomenon, and that the presentation of improved races in the struggle for life had produced, by a natural evolution, the whole wondrous world of organic life. Today, when evolution is almost universally recognized in biology, when thousands of anatomic and physiological works are based on it every year, a new generation can hardly form an idea of the violent resistance that was offered to Darwin's theory and the impassioned struggles it provoked. In the first place, the churches at once raised a vigorous protest. They rightly regarded their new antagonist as the deadly enemy of the legend of creation, and saw the very foundations of their creed threatened. The churches found a powerful ally in the dualistic metaphysics that still claims to represent the real idealist philosophy at most universities. But most dangerous of all to the young theory was the violent resistance it met almost everywhere in its own province of empirical science. The prevailing belief in the fixity and the independent creation of the various species was much more seriously menaced by Darwin's theory than it had been by Lamarck's transformation. Lamarck had said substantially the same thing 50 years before, but had failed to convince through the lack of effective evidence. Many scientists, some of great distinction, opposed Darwin because either they had not an adequate acquaintance with the whole field of biology, or it seemed to them that his bold speculation advanced too far from the secure base of experience. When Darwin's work appeared in 1859 and fell like a flash of lightning on the dark world of official biology, I was engaged in a scientific expedition to Sicily and taken up with a thorough study of the graceful radiolarians, whose wonderful microscopic marine animals that surpass all other organisms in the beauty and variety of their forms. The special study of this remarkable class of animals, of which I afterwards described more than 4,000 species, after more than 10 years of research, provided me with one of the solid foundation stones of my Darwinian ideas. But when I had returned from Messina to Berlin in the spring of 1860, I knew nothing as yet of Darwin's achievement. I merely heard from my friends at Berlin that a remarkable work by a crazy Englishman had attracted great attention, and that it turned upside down all previous ideas as to the origin of the species. I soon perceived that almost all the experts at Berlin, chief amongst them were the famous microscopist Erdenberg, the anatomist Reichart, the zoologist Peters, the geologist Bayrich, were unanimous in their condemnation of Darwin. The brilliant orator of the Berlin Academy, Emile du Bois-Reymond, hesitated. He recognized that the theory of evolution was the only natural solution of the problem of creation, but he laughed at the application of it as a poor romance, and declared that the phylogenetic inquiries into the relationship of the various species had about as much value as the research of philologists into the genealogical tree of the Homeric heroes. Homeric heroes. The distinguished botanist Alexander Braun stood quite alone in his full and warm assent to the theory of evolution. I found comfort and encouragement with this dear and respected teacher when I was deeply moved by the first reading of Darwin's book, and soon completely converted to his view. In Darwin's great and harmonious conception of nature, and his convincing establishment of evolution, I had an answer to all the doubts that had beset me since the beginning of my biological studies. My famous teacher, Rudolf Virchow, whom I had met at Würzburg in 1852, and was soon associated with in the most friendly relations as special pupil and admiring assistant, played a very curious part in this great controversy. I am, I think, one of those elderly men who have followed Virchow's development as man and thinker with the greatest interest. During the last 50 years, I distinguished 3 periods in his psychological metamorphosis. In the first decade of his academic life, from 1847 to 1858, mainly at Würzburg, he effected the great reform of medicine that culminated brilliantly in his cellular pathology. In the following 20 years, 1858 to 1877, he was chiefly occupied with politics and anthropology. He was at first favorable to Darwinism, then skeptical, and finally rejected it. His powerful and determined opposition to it dates from 1877, when in his famous speech on the freedom of science in the modern state, he struck a heavy blow at that freedom, denounced the theory of evolution as dangerous to the state, and demanded its exclusion from the schools. We can only glance briefly here at the victorious struggle that the idea of evolution has conducted in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. The violent resistance that Darwinism encountered nearly everywhere in its early years was paralyzed towards the end of the first decade. In the years 1866 to 1874, many works were published in which not only were the foundations of the theory scientifically strengthened, but its general recognition was secured by popular treatment of the subjects. I made the first attempt in 1866 in my General Morphology to present connectedly the whole subject of evolution, to make it the foundation of a consistent monistic philosophy, and I then gave a popular summary of my chief conclusions in the 10 editions of my History of Creation. In my Evolution of Man, I made the first attempt to apply the principles of evolution thoroughly and consistently to man, and to draw up a hypothetical list of his animal ancestors. The 3 volumes of my systematic phylogeny, 1894 to 1896, contain a fuller outline of a natural classification or organisms on the basis of their stem history. There have been important contributions to the science of evolution in all its branches, in the Darwin periodical Cosmos since 1877, and a number of admirable popular works helped to spread the system. However, the most important and most welcome advance was made by science when, in the last 30 years, the idea of evolution penetrated into every branch of biology and was recognized as fundamental and indispensable. Thousands of new discoveries and observations in all sections of botany, zoology, prostotology, and anthropology were brought forward as empirical evidence of evolution. This is especially true of the remarkable progress of paleontology, comparative anatomy, and embryology, but it applies also to physiology, chorology, 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 the science of the distribution of living things. And ecology, The description of the habits of animals? Yeah, I guess. It's an Oecology. I'm not sure what it is. How much our horizon was extended by these, and how much the unity of our monastic system gained, can be seen in any modern manual of biology. If we compare them with those that gave us extracts of natural history 40 or 50 years ago, we see at once what an enormous advance has taken place. Even the more remote branches of anthropological science, and ethnography, sociology, ethics, and jurisprudence are entering into closer relations with the theory of evolution, and can no longer escape its influence. In view of all this, it is ridiculous for theological and metaphysical journals to talk as they do of the failure of evolution and the deathbed of Darwinism. Our science of evolution won its greatest triumph when, at the beginning of the 20th century, its most powerful opponents, the churches, became reconciled to it and endeavored to bring their dogmas into line with it. A number of timid attempts to do so had been made in the preceding 10 years by different free-thinking theologians and philosophers, but without much success. The distinction of accomplishing this in a comprehensive and well-informed manner was reserved for Jesuit Father Eric Wassmann of Luxembourg. This able and learned entomologist had already earned some recognition in zoology by a series of admirable observations on the life of ants and the captives that they always keep in their homes, certain very small insects which have themselves been curiously modified by adaptation to their peculiar environment. He showed that these striking modifications can only be rationally explained by descent from other free-living species of insects. The various papers in which Wassmann gave a thoroughly Darwinian explanation of the biological phenomenon first appeared 1901 to 1903 in the Catholic periodical Stiemann aus Mariloch, and are now being collected in a special work entitled Modern Biology and the Theory of Evolution. This remarkable book of Wassmann's is a masterpiece of Jesuitical sophistry. It really consists of three entirely different sections. The first third gives, in the introduction, what is, for Catholics, a clear and instructive account of modern biology, especially the cell theory and the theory of evolution, chapters 1 through 8. The second third, the 9th chapter, is the most valuable part of the work. It has the title, The Theory of Fixity, or The Theory of Evolution. Oh, it's a question. The Theory of Fixity, or The Theory of Evolution. Here, the learned entomologist gives an interesting account of the results of his prolonged studies of the morphology and the oecology of the ants and their captives, the Myromechophilia, Myromechophyla. He shows impartially and convincingly that these complicated and remarkable phenomena can only be explained by evolution, and that the older doctrine of the fixity and independent creation of the various species is quite unattainable. With a few changes, this 9th chapter could figure as a useful part of a work by Darwin or Weismann or some other evolutionist. The succeeding chapter, the last third, is flagrantly inconsistent with the 9th. It deals most absurdly with the application of the theory of evolution to man. The reader has to ask himself whether Wassmann really believes these confused and ridiculous notions, or whether he merely aims at befogging his readers, and so preparing the way for the acceptance of the conventional creed. Wassmann's book has been well criticized by a number of competent students, especially by Eschreich and France. While fully recognizing these great services, they insist very strongly on the great mischief wrought by this smuggling of the Jesuitical spirit into biology. Eichrecht points out at length the glaring inconsistencies and the obvious untruths of this ecclesiastical evolution. He summarizes his criticism in the words, "If the theory of evolution can really be reconciled with the dogmas of the Church only in the way that we find here, Wassmann was clearly proved that any such reconciliation is impossible, because what Wassmann gives here as the theory of evolution is a thing mutilated beyond recognition and incapable of any validity. He tries, like a good Jesuit, to prove that it does not tend to undermine, but to give a firm foundation to the story of supernatural creation, and that it was really not Lamarck and Darwin, but St. Augustine and St. Thomas of Aquin, who founded the science of evolution. God does not interfere directly in the order of nature when he can act by means of natural causes. Man alone constitutes a remarkable exception, because the human soul, being a spiritual entity, cannot be derived from matter even by the divine omnipotence, like the vital forms of plants and animals." In an instructive article in the Jesuitical Science in the Frankfurt Freie Wort, number 22 of 1904, R.H. France gives an interesting list of the prominent Jesuits who are now at work in the various branches of science. As he rightly says, the danger consists in a systematic introduction of the Jesuitical spirit into science, a persistent perversion of all its problems and solutions, and an astute undermining of its foundations. To speak more precisely, the danger is that people are not sufficiently conscious of it, and that they, and even science itself, fall into the cleverly prepared pit of believing that there is such a thing as Jesuitical science, the results of which may be taken seriously. While fully recognizing these dangers, I nevertheless feel that Jesuit Father Wassmann and his colleagues have unwittingly done a very great service to the progress of pure science. The Catholic Church, the most powerful and widespread of the Christian sects, sees itself compelled to capitulate in the idea of evolution. It embraces the most important application of the idea, Lamarck and Darwin's theory of descent, which it had vigorously combated until 20 years ago. It does indeed mutilate the great tree, cutting off its roots and its highest branch. It rejects spontaneous generation, or arachnology, at the bottom, and the descent of man from animal ancestors above. But these exceptions will not last. Impartial biology will take no notice of them, and the religious creed will at length determine that the more complex species have been evolved from a series of simpler forms according to Darwinian principles. The belief in a supernatural creation is restricted to the production of the earliest and simplest stem forms, from which the natural species have taken their origin. Wassmann gives that name to all species that are demonstrably descended from a common stem form. In other words, to what other classifiers call stems or phyla, the 4,000 species of ants in his system, which he believes to be genetically related, are comprised by him in one natural species. On the other hand, man forms one isolated natural species for himself, without any connection with the other mammals. The Jesuitical sophistry that Wassmann betrays in his ingenious distinction between systematic and natural species is also found in his Philosophic Thoughts on Evolution, chapter 8. His distinction between philosophic and scientific evolution, or between evolution in one stem and in several stems, his remarks in chapter 7 on the cell and spontaneous generation, are similarly marred by sophistry, 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 sophistry. The question of spontaneous generation, or arachnology, that is to say, of the first appearance of organic life on the earth, is one of the most difficult problems in biology, one of those in which the most distinguished students portray a striking weakness of judgment. Dr. Heinrich Schmidt of Genoa has lately written an able and popular little work on the subject in his Spontaneous Generation, and Professor Ranke of 1903. It has shown to what absurd consequences the ecological ideas lead on this very question. The botanist Ranke of Kiel is now regarded amongst religious people as the chief opponent of Darwinism. For many conservatives, this is because he is a member of the Prussian Herrenhaus? Yeah, Herrenhaus, a very intelligent body, of course. Although he is a strong evangelical, many of his mystic deductions agree surprisingly with the Catholic speculations of Father Wassman. This is especially the case with regard to spontaneous generation. They both declare that the first appearance of life must be traced to a miracle, to the work of a personal deity, whom Ranke calls the cosmic intelligence. I have shown that the unscientific character of these notions in my last two works, The Riddle of the Universe and The Wonders of Life. I have drawn attention especially to the widely distributed monera of the Chromonesia class, organisms of the simplest type conceivable, whose whole body is merely an unnucleated green structureless globule of plasm. Their whole vital activity consists of growth by forming plasm and multiplication by dividing into two. There is little theoretical difficulty in conceiving the origin of these new simple monera from inorganic compounds of albumin, or their later transformation into the simplest nucleated cells. And this, and a good deal more that will not fit into his Jesuitical frame, is shrewdly ignored by Wassman. In a view of the great influence that Catholicism still has on public life in Germany through the Center Party, this change of front should be a great gain to education. Virchow demanded as late as 1877 that the dangerous doctrine of evolution should be excluded from the schools. The ministers of instruction of the two chief German states gratefully adopted this warning from the leader of the Progressive Party, forbade the teaching of Darwinian ideas, and made every effort to check the spread of biological knowledge. Now, 25 years afterwards, the Jesuits come forward and demand the opposite. They recognize openly that the hated theory of evolution is established and try to reconcile it with the creed. What an irony of history! And we find much the same story when we read the struggles for freedom of thought and for the recognition of evolution. Recognition of evolution in the other educated countries of Europe. In Italy, its cradle and home, educated people generally look upon the papacy with the most profound disdain. I have spent many years in Italy, and have never met an educated Italian of such bigoted and narrow views as we usually find amongst educated German Catholics, represented with success in the Reichstag by the Center Party. It is proof enough of the reactionary character of German Catholics that the Pope himself describes them as his most vigorous soldiers and points them out as models to the faithful of other nations. As the whole history of the Roman Church shows, the charlatan of the Vatican is the deadly enemy of free science and free teaching. The present German emperor ought to regard it as his most sacred duty to maintain the tradition of the Reformation and to promote the formation of the German people in the sense of Frederick the Great. Instead of this, we have to look on with heavy hearts while the emperor, badly advised and misled by those in influence above him, suffers himself to be caught closer and closer in the net of the Catholic clergy. and sacrifices to it the intelligence of the rising generation. In September 1904, the Catholic journals announced triumphantly that the adoption of Catholicism by the Emperor and his Chancellor were close at hand. The firmness of the belief in conventional dogmas, which hampers the progress of rational enlightenment in Orthodox Protestant circles as well as Catholic, is often admired as an expression of the deep emotion of the German people. But its real source is their confusion of thought and their credulity, the power of conservative tradition and the reactionary state of political education. While our schools are bent under the yoke of the creeds, those of our neighbors are free. France, the pious daughter of the Church, gives anxious moments to her ambitious mother. She is breaking the chains of concordant and taking up the work of the Reformation. In Germany, the birthplace of the Reformation, the Reichstag and the government vie with each other in smoothing the paths for the Jesuits and fostering instead of suppressing the intolerant spirit of the sectarian school. Let us hope that the latest episode in the history of evolution, its recognition by Jesuitical science, will bring about the reverse of what they intended, the substitution of rational science for blind faith. And that's where we'll stop for part 2 of Little Blue Book number 49. 3 lectures on evolution, written by Ernst Haeckel. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.